Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, and just as a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck, although I do think it should be fairly easy to find substitutes for those expensive cards. But before that, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. We're well on our way to 1 million subscribers, and every single click counts. And today we're going to be building around Gandalf the White for 3 colorless and 2 white. It's a legendary creature, Avatar Wizard 4/5 with Flash. You may cast legendary spells and artifact spells as though they had Flash. And if a legendary permanent or an artifact entering or leaving the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So this card is really sweet and has quite a few different ways to build around, surprisingly. I found him to be very good in the 99 of legendary decks, no surprise. But here I'm not going to be trying to build around legendaries as much. I thought I'd give it a try as an artifact commander because I think there's a lot of really cool synergies that can work with that. The cards that first drew me to that kind of archetype were the Wellspring kind of cards that trigger on ETB and on Death Trigger, which Gandalf works really well with. So that's one of the things we're going to be focusing on today. It's going to be a very kind of synergistic deck with lots of different pieces clicking together and working together to gain incremental values. So I'm very excited about this one because that's my kind of deck. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started, and we're starting off with Angel of the Ruins. This creature is very underplayed in Commander as a whole, but it's going to be very good in this deck because we have a lot of ways to recur it from the graveyard, which means the cycling is good, and it's also great with Gandalf because it gets to double its trigger. Arcbound Crusher is a really good one in this deck. We have a ton of artifacts, so this is going to get very big, and you'll notice that that is a triggered ability on Arcbound Crusher, so with Gandalf out, it's going to get 2 counters every time. Not only that, when it dies, Gandalf is going to double the modular trigger, so we're going to get to put double those counters on something else. This is very good. Arcbound Ravager is another of our modular cards. This one, again, is really fantastic in this deck. We can kind of use it as well to turn on a lot of our synergies. We have a lot of artifacts that want to be sacrificed, so having a free sack outlet that gives us value is amazing. And finally, for our third modular card, we're running Arcbound Reclaimer. This one should be very good at recurring certain artifacts that we maybe can't recur in other ways. We have many ways to transfer counters onto it, and also the modular, again, is going to double counters when it dies, so that's pretty good. Bronze Guardian is going to be great by giving protection to all of our artifacts and making it harder for our opponents to interact with us, and it's going to be a huge threat as well. Canoptech Scarab Swarm is going to be really good graveyard hate, and if we have Gandalf out, it's going to trigger twice, which should give us a ton of tokens and exile 2 graveyards. Canoptech Spider is again going to be fantastic with Gandalf because we're going to be drawing 2 cards every time a non-token artifact enters the battlefield. Circuit Mender is one of those cards that feels like it was perfectly made for this deck. It's going to gain us 4 life on ETB and draws 2 cards on death if we have Gandalf out, which is fantastic for 3 mana. Combat Thresher is a pretty solid card at any point in the curve. We're mostly going to be playing it at 3 mana to draw 2 cards with Gandalf and have a 1/1 double striker, but when we reanimate it, it's going to come back as a 3/3 double striker, which is much better. Daxos Blessed by the Sun is one of the few legendary creatures in the deck. It also works very well with Gandalf because it's going to be doubling up all the ETB and death triggers from all of our legendaries and artifacts entering, which means we're going to gain 2 life on each instance of one of those effects. Digsite Engineer doesn't trigger off of Gandalf, but it is, however, a great way to get repeatable huge bodies, particularly since we're casting so many artifacts in this deck. Duplicant is excellent removal, which is made even better by the fact that you can remove 2 things with this when Gandalf is in play. Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, is going to work so well with all of the enter the battlefield effects that we have. It is a pity that it's going to draw so much hate from the table, so you do have to assume that this is going to die fairly quickly. Ether Sworn Canonist keeps our opponents very fair. We're playing an artifact deck with a lot of expensive artifacts, so we don't want our opponents to kind of run away ahead of us, and one way to guarantee that is to make sure they can only play 1 non-artifact spell a turn. Filigree Familiar basically does the same thing as Circuit Mender. 4 life and 2 cards is just too good to pass up. Filigree Vector is a really interesting one. It's one of our ways we can finish the game by buffing all of our team and giving them a bunch of +1/+1 counters, and then we can actually use it as a sack outlet as well. So it does a lot of good things that this deck is looking for. Refinery Inspector is kind of like ramp in this deck since most of our cards are artifacts. Hangerback Walker is very interesting with Gandalf because when it dies, we're going to get double the amount of flying creature tokens with this, and that works very well with the previously mentioned Filigree Vector. Trigger's Familiar is similar to Foundry Inspector. It's going to reduce the cost of all of our artifacts by 1. Junk Diver is a really good card in this deck. We have so much sacrifice and recursion that this can be great, particularly when it's being doubled by Gandalf. Karn Legacy Reforged can get fairly big in this deck, but more importantly, it's going to add us a ton of mana every turn that is definitely going to allow us to keep ahead from our opponents. Kuldotha Forge Master is really solid when we have this many artifacts running around, particularly when we have so many token artifacts, so we can sacrifice 3 of them to search for whatever we want and put it straight onto the battlefield, which is really great. Liberator is a card that I really like in this deck. We're going to get counters on it very quickly since Gandalf is going to double them, so that means that while it'll be capped at how big it can grow earlier, it will get there a lot faster, and then being able to play all of our artifact spells as though they had flash is fantastic. Lauren of the Third Path is just too good to pass up, even in an artifact deck. Being able to destroy 2 things on ETB with Gandalf out is just great. Lauren Disciple of History is similarly great with Gandalf because we're going to get to return 2 artifacts from our graveyard. Lorshiel Clockwork Scholar is so much better in a Gandalf deck because it's going to draw us 2 cards instead of 1 when an artifact enters the battlefield, and then it's obviously very good when we're attacking with artifact creatures. Meteor Golem is pretty expensive without Gandalf out, but if you do have Gandalf out, it becomes a very good rate. Mir Battlesphere will make an absolute ton of Mirs if we have Gandalf out. Getting 8 off of just 1 creature is really good, particularly since we have so many ways to go wide and use the tokens. Mir Retriever is a nice little engine card that just gets much better with Gandalf out. Samwise the Stout-Hearted is very interesting because it's a great response to a board wipe, and since Gandalf himself has flash, if we have enough mana up, we can flash both of these in after a board wipe and just get 2 things back from our graveyard that just died. That's a very strong play. Scrap Trawler is very interesting because it kind of gives all of our artifacts recursion in a way, particularly with Gandalf out. This gets really crazy and it's very difficult for our opponents to interact with our board. Scrapyard Recombiner is another modular card that's also a sack outlet, which is something we definitely want. We have 10 constructs in the deck, so this should almost always have a target, so this just does a lot of work in this deck. Solemn is so much better in this deck than in other decks. If we draw it after we have Gandalf out, it just becomes a ramp 2 that then draws 2 when it dies, which is incredible. Teshar, Ancestor's Apostle, is going to do a lot of work in this deck because we have a lot of creatures that are mana value 3 or less, and we're playing a ton of artifacts. It is worth noting though that it doesn't get triggered by Gandalf since it is a cast trigger. Thran Spider is going to pull serious work. We don't really care about giving our opponents Power Stone tokens because we can definitely find someone who can't use them that well. If we get to double this with Gandalf, it feels really gross. Treasure Keeper is a card that's borderline in a lot of decks, but in this deck it's much better because obviously you can get to trigger it twice with Gandalf out. It's just a very solid death trigger, and we have a lot of days to sacrifice it for value in this deck. Workshop Assistant is another of those cards that allow us to recur artifacts from our graveyard, and Wormcoil Engine is a big beefy threat that can kind of get out of hand if we have Gandalf out by creating 4 token copies. Moving on to artifacts, we have Ica Wellspring, which is just incredible with Gandalf out. So much value. You're going to draw 2 cards on ETB and draw 2 cards on death, which is great. Ingenuity Engine pulls a lot of work in this deck by being a cheap sack outlet that also allows us to protect some of our artifacts from targeted removal. Mycosynth Wellspring is similar to Ica Wellspring, except instead of drawing 2 cards, we're going to be searching for 2 lands on ETB and on death. Mystic Forge can give us a lot of really solid card advantage in this deck, which is something that we definitely need. Nimblewright's Schematic is a source of 4 1/1 tokens. Those can be great for sacrifice fodder or just to grow our board late game with Filigree Vector. Price Statue again is great with Gandalf and good without him. It's 3 artifacts for 1 without Gandalf out, but with Gandalf out it gives us 5 total artifacts for 2 mana. Servo Schematic is essentially another copy of Nimblewright Schematic. Spine of Isha is a card that I like maybe a little bit more than I should, but in this deck I can totally justify playing it because destroying 2 things on ETB is just so good. The One Ring is incredibly expensive at the moment, but if you happen to have it, it's a good include in the deck because obviously we have a ton of ways to recur it and to return it to our hand, whether that be Ingenuity Engine or all of the graveyard recursion cards that we have that put it back into our hand. So this is definitely very good in the deck. And Trading Post is going to be a great way to turn our resources into different resources that we may need. Don't underestimate the ability to gain 4 life at instant speed. It has got me out of some pickles in the past, but for sure in this deck the sacrifice and artifact one is going to be the most likely option most of the time. For instance, we have Dispatch, which is very close to hard removal in this deck. Generous Gift is a staple in most commander decks and for good reason. Kabira Takedown should be able to take down most opposing creatures because we do have a lot of creatures of our own. Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares are both good unconditional removal, and and Sajiri's Shelter is a great way to protect our important cards. For sorceries, we have Emiria's Core that can make us a couple of chunky flies and give our creatures indestructible for a big attack. Farewell is a pretty decent board wipe in this deck because we can mess with our opponent's board and keep our artifacts intact. And Organic Extinction is another decent board wipe that shouldn't really affect our board very much. For Planeswalkers, we have the Eternal Wanderer. This is a really good one in this deck because we can rebuy the ETB triggers of our artifacts with her +1. She's usually mostly good for the -4, which is still excellent in this deck, but the fact that her +1 is this relevant is going to make her really solid. For lands, we have Buried Ruin, which is another way to recur artifacts from our graveyard. Emiria the Sky Ruin is going to be very good late game, and we have a ton of planes in play. Inventor's Fur is going to gain life every single turn in this deck, and also being a tutor is really great. Minas Tirith is a great land from Lord of the Rings, which should draw us some cards here. Scavenger Grounds allows us to deal with our opponent's graveyard. Tectonic Edge is there to deal with any problem lands that we might encounter, and War Room is just a way for us to draw extra cards. So there you have it. That has been our Gandalf the White deck tech. I'm really excited about this one because it's just the kind of synergy wheel spinning deck that I love, so I will probably eventually throw it together. What do you think about this one? Are there any cards that you wouldn't have added or things that you think I missed? Let me know in the comment section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!